Okay, so pretty late in the game here in terms of getting this video out. So rather than do what I would normally do to edit it and add the questions and everything else, I am just doing it live. And hopefully I'll be able to get it all in and clear in one take, and we'll see how it goes. So I'll try not to make this a regular thing, but for this week, we're just going to wing it. So I'll go ahead and start. We are in the book of John, chapter 2, starting in verse 13, and we are going to verse 22. So I will read it, and then I will talk about it. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting there. And making a whip of cords, he drove them out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembered that it was written, His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." So the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scriptures and the word that Jesus had spoken. So, another story that I think a lot of us are probably pretty familiar with. Jesus is cleansing the temple. He's going in, he's flipping tables, he's cracking the whip, he's running the animals out, he's, telling people like it is. But one thing that's kind of interesting, at least to me, I think the way this has always been presented or told, and even, when it's represented in film or whatever, we see Jesus that looks a little rage filled. He's, getting worked up and cracking the whip and yelling at people and, tipping the tables over in their direction and pouring all the money out, in their faces kind of thing. And that may be entirely accurate, but we don't see any of that description here. It's not explicit in its description of Jesus as being super angry or kind of over the top with, making people feel his righteous anger. He's just kind of going about his business, addressing the concerns that need to be addressed, calling out the problems that are there, and making sure that it's not really able to continue. So I don't know if anybody else kind of gets that from it, but knowing that Jesus's demeanor was different than most people and what we tend to expect, I think it's easy for us to look at this and go, "Wow, this is just a big temper tantrum. Essentially, this is just a big fit, and he's getting all worked up." But it doesn't necessarily say that that's what's happening. So I'd love to talk more about that, but we can touch on that in our discussion. A couple other points to point out here. One thing that I thought was really interesting in reading a little bit further about this situation, when Jesus shows up to the temple, what you have at the temple is there's a building, which is the temple where the Jews go for their worship, and it says that this is during the Passover, and so that's what's going on. It's in Jerusalem, so it's kind of a place that's higher in elevation than everywhere around it. It's a place for people to gather. And so while you have that building, there's also this area around the temple, outside of the temple, that is also considered the temple. It's all part of it, but it's not necessarily the building itself. And this is where these things are going on. This is kind of the setup, that you've got this marketplace essentially going on the temple ground, so to speak. This is, if you're at a big church, this is the parking lot, basically. An interesting thing is that what's going on out there, this includes people who aren't necessarily Jews, because again, this is a kind of central place of a big city during a big holiday time. And so you've got people there that are not necessarily Jews, but that are participating in this market and everything else. And so it's a bad example that's being set by the Jewish community to the Gentiles that are there. And the part of the purpose of the market, one of the things, among other things, I mean, it's easy to just look at it and this is just trade that's taking place, and it's just leveraging the fact that this is where people are going to be, and so people are taking advantage of it. That's partially true, but what's also happening is that people are coming from a far distance, and they're not necessarily obligated to bring an animal to sacrifice. That's part of the Passover process, is bringing their sacrifice and making that sacrifice while they're there. And so the fact that there's people selling essentially animals for that purpose outside significantly cheapens what's happening. And so that's another piece that's playing into this as well, that that what Jesus is upset about is not just that people are conducting business and turning this into a place of business, but what the business is itself is also pretty corrupt and a pretty terrible perversion of not only God's house, but of the whole Passover process and of the whole process of sacrifice. So that has kind of its own little rabbit trail that I will circle back to, but I'm just trying to hit a couple of things here as I'm going through this. But the next thing to me that stood out, I think it's kind of funny the way John writes it, is you have these two specific scenarios where Jesus says something, and then it's like, he said this, and then the disciples remembered this other thing, where the first time it's a scripture, they remember something from the Old Testament, and then the next time he references, he jumps ahead in time to when Jesus is crucified and then resurrected, and says, and this came to all of our minds, when Jesus rose again on the third day. And it's like he just talks about all the disciples as if they all just spontaneously have the same revelation at the same time, which is probably not very likely, but he's attempting to make a point, right? He's attempting to demonstrate that the things that are happening and the things Jesus is saying are very deliberate, and they're tied specifically to other events and other prophecies and other words from God. So John is very particular about tying those things together. And so the first thing that he says, or the first reference that he makes, I should say, is to the book of Psalm, chapter 29. So or 69, I'm sorry. It's the 69th Psalm, and it's David, and he's talking about being essentially hated by his own people and hated by his brothers, and being in a place that is dangerous for him. And he describes being having zeal for God's house, being consumed by zeal for the house of the Lord. And that's the reference that John mentions in, I think it's verse 17. His disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me. So this is a callback to this psalm, and it's not just the one verse where he says this, but if you look at that verse in context and you read through David crying out to God in this time when he is kind of outcast and in the position of being being harmed by his own people, which is exactly the position that Jesus finds himself in. And he steps right into it. I mean, he puts himself in the position of being the target. And so John I think is referencing not just the one line, but he's drawing the comparison to David in that situation as well. The other references to Jesus being raised from the dead in 3 days, and so his body is resurrected, and that's the temple that he's referring to. And if you read in 1 Corinthians, Paul actually says twice, once in the 3rd chapter and once in the 6th chapter, that the body of a believer is a temple. And so not only is Jesus's body a temple, but anywhere where God dwells is a temple, and God dwells within us. And so the idea of the body being a temple is a consistent theme, is a consistent concept throughout Christendom and throughout Christianity. So throughout the New Testament, I mean, so we see this repeated, but Jesus is the first, kind of the forerunner of that, right? I mean, he's the one that gives us the ability to do that. So when he says, you destroy this temple, I will build it back up again, he wasn't talking about building back up the physical temple, but he was talking about building up his body as the temple, but also the ability for all of us to be a temple, because all of us become a dwelling place for God. And that brings up another interesting point from my perspective anyway. And this, again, is another one of my kind of attempts to understand this from a higher level or deeper level, I guess, whichever direction you want to take it. But it's interesting, though, that Jesus, so, we get the intro to John, and it's just kind of describing Jesus as being part of the Godhead. And then we get into Jesus finally kind of comes into the story with his baptism by John the Baptizer, and then he calls his disciples, and then we have the wedding, and then we have this cleansing of the temple. And so the cleansing of the temple is, this process of kind of getting some of the bad stuff out of there, getting some of the garbage out, and reshaping the way people think about it. And we've talked a lot about Jesus reshaping the way people think about things. But if we think about our bodies as temples, if we think about ourselves as individuals as being dwelling places for the Lord, there's something about that idea that is a process that we should be doing. And I think that John is, kind of setting up a bigger theme here as he goes through baptism, which is kind of a literal cleansing of the body. And then when Jesus goes to the wedding, the jars that he's using to turn the water into wine are part of the purification ritual, but he's changing their purpose, and he's doing that at this place where there's this new covenant being made. And we talked about that last week. So there's this new covenant. So like he goes through the physical act of baptism, then he makes his the first sign of his identity as the Messiah is being conducted or performed or carried out at this new covenant. And then immediately after that, he goes anyway, right? He goes straight to this temple and says, okay, now we got to clean this up. So he's going through this process of not only, beginning his ministry, but also kind of outlining in broader terms what the beginning of a relationship with Christ, what the beginning of the process of the new covenant that you're becoming a part of when you become a part of the body of Christ, what that is. And again, I didn't look up any references. I know that we use the term body of Christ. I know that's part of the way it's described in Scripture in the New Testament as well. And if Christ's body is the temple, then it's the people who make it up that are the temple as well. So again, I know that's a little bit of a far out there kind of thing, but and we'll continue to kind of track this through the course of the rest. Through the course of the rest of the book. But I do think that there's a kind of an abstraction that you can make that John, not that Jesus is necessarily, operating this way, because we know that John is kind of mixing things around and putting stories in the order that he wants them to tell this narrative in the way to kind of drive home the point he wants people to understand. And so I don't think that that it's too far of a stretch to think that John is using these specific stories in the way he's using them to kind of make this clear line across. But like I said, we'll continue to track that as we go, and we'll see if it continues to make sense, or if it's just something that sounds interesting but doesn't have a lot of basis to it. I don't know. So kind of the main thing, though, and I know I've already talked for like 15 minutes, and that's how long it takes me to get to my main point. So sorry, but the main thing to me, the main thing that sticks out when I kind of take a step back and look at this and try to summarize or think about what we can pull out of this for ourselves. We see the church turning itself into this marketplace for cheapening grace, for kind of attracting people to something that is not God and is not related to God and his dwelling place, but is related to leveraging worldly things, leveraging, wealth or the ability to trade successfully, using God's name and God's house to do that. And I think that's something that we see today. Modern seeker sensitive philosophies might think that they're new and innovative, but that's essentially what's happening here. I mean, it's the same idea. Let's get people here, and we can dress it up as it's a good thing because they're here. And Jesus comes in and says, that's not how it works. You can't just try to get people here and say, because here is the temple, then it's good that people are here. If you're not using the temple the way it's supposed to, then the temple is no good anyway. And so I think that it's easy to sit back and, like I just did, take a jab at things like seeker sensitive approaches to churches or church planning or whatever. But I think the reason that those things happen is because it's so easy to fall into patterns, to fall into these destructive patterns where at some point people decide along the way that, well, what's it going to hurt? Let's make this little exception here or this little exception there. And before long, it becomes accepted, right? I mean, there's a whole community functioning in this way within this area, in this marketplace, in this temple, and nobody seems to be upset about it. Nobody seems to be stopping it. Everybody seems to be participating and perfectly happy with it. And while that may not be true, there may be some people who, inside themselves feel like it's wrong, but don't have the confidence or whatever to speak out. And, we're not living in a society where they have, constitutional protection to free speech, that it's a little bit more difficult to speak truth to power. But for the most part, these things don't continue. These functions, these processes don't get ingrained and become these patterns if people aren't willing to accept it and participate it and just go with the flow or be content with the idea that this is just the way that it is. And if you talk to people, I hear this a lot, like in the business world, of people who they say they hate the idea of, why do you do it this way? Well, it's just because it's the way we've always done it. Everybody trash talks that phrase, but everybody does it. There are certain things that we just can't necessarily think about or try to solve. I was thinking about this earlier, and I was thinking of, little things that I do all day long, like brush my teeth. I do it because I know I need to do it. And I have a toothbrush, and it's electrical, and the little thing spins on the end, and I put this stuff out of this tube onto it, and I know that it works because I'm told that it works, and over time you see results of that. But is that the best way? I don't know. I'm not going to put a whole lot of thought into solving what's the best way to brush my teeth because I got too many other things to worry about. And so we all have these routines or these rituals or these patterns that we just let happen, let take place, and let carry on in our lives all the time, just because we can't formally map out every single process we ever have to do. It's just not realistic. So we prioritize the things that mean the most to us, and everything else we just say, well, this is the way everybody does it. This is the way everybody's always done it. There's no reason for me to challenge that. I'm not trying to be an early adopter of some crazy new way of, teeth cleaning. I'm just gonna this is the way I saw my parents do it, and that's the way they saw their parents do it, and this is the way I'm going to teach my kids to do it, and then their kids will do it that way, and we all just do it. And it's kind of a bad example because, toothbrushing is not a hugely significant thing, and it doesn't really have any impact on our souls at all. But it's just an example of the way that we all have some degree to which we do that. And maybe for some of us, toothbrushing is the only thing that we do that falls into that box, and everything else we question it and we figure it out for ourselves, and we don't just let tradition take hold. But I don't think that's true. I think we all have some degree of that, some of us more than others. And I think that when that starts to happen, that's when things start to get dangerous, not just for individuals, but for the church as a whole. Or you could say that same sentence backward, not just for the church as a whole, but for individuals, right? Whichever way it sounds the worst, it's not one or the other. It's both. Both the individual and the entire body is weakened and is less capable of delivering on what it's called to do when people aren't taking responsibility and pushing back against things that are clearly wrong. And that's what Jesus is doing. And the leaders ask him what authority he has to do it, and he doesn't even answer them. He just tells them, look, you're going to destroy this thing. It's not even an if. It's going to happen. And so, if you look at the words, it's in verse 19. Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. It's not if you mess up and this temple gets destroyed, he knows that's what's happening. He knows that's what's coming, and he's not challenging them in that. He's not challenging them to destroy the temple. He's not saying, I dare you to destroy the temple. He's saying this is the direction that this thing is headed. I can see it. You can't. And for him at that time, maybe he was the only one that could see it because he's God and he knew what he was looking for, and nobody else could see it. He had to reveal that to them through this process. But we don't have that excuse. He's already showed us what it is. So now it's our responsibility to look for those things and address them. And at the end of the day, the people who are kind of on the hook here are the leaders. These are the people who allowed it to happen. These are the people who, maybe there were some priests or other leaders within the church who had a problem with it, but didn't want to rock the boat. Didn't want to put themselves in the position of being the bad cop, or the one to rain on the parade, or the guy that hurt their coffers when it came to the amount of money they were able to make through this process. But Jesus is pretty clear that we don't have the option to be that guy. Being in a position of leadership has a certain level of responsibility, and at the end of the day, that's who Jesus looks at. But just because the people at the top are the ones who are going to have to answer for it, everybody who participates is going to have to answer for it as well. And so I think it's important for us to remember that wherever we are, whatever situation we find ourselves in, within church, within our communities, within our workplaces, within our families, it's not enough to say it's the way we've always done it. It's not enough to say, well, I'm not the boss, I don't get to make those decisions. It's not enough to say that this is, it would cost too much to give it up. None of those explanations are good enough. And so we should be challenging ourselves to fight that. And I think that is part of what's driving Jesus here. That's part of what we see happening. And so that is everything that I had on this as I look at my notes to confirm. I think we're good. So we will go ahead and wrap this up. And I don't have, since I'm just live streaming and throwing this up there, I don't have any nice graphics or anything to show you the questions. So I will just read through them and leave it at that. So the first question is, how do you imagine Jesus's demeanor in this scene? So I mentioned that one up front. doesn't necessarily describe him as being kind of this rage-filled temper tantrum that we see it depicted as. And again, not that it's not that. I'm just curious what it looks like to you. The second question is, do you think anyone else has the right to do what Jesus did here? So I kind of touched on that just a minute ago. He's God, so maybe he had some, special knowledge of exactly what was wrong and what he could do to address it. But if one of the disciples had gone in and done this, would it be acceptable in God's eyes too? So just something to think about. The third question, do you see the church falling into destructive patterns that need to be addressed? So things that people do just because they're comfortable and it becomes a pattern that somebody needs to call out and speak up and see if there's something that needs to be talked about. Then personally, how do you fight the complacency or the earthly desires that allow these destructive patterns to take root in your own life or in your community or family or whatever it is? And then given that leaders have this greater level of responsibility, do you feel fit to be a leader? And why or why not? So come and we'll talk about it. Thank you.